Welcome to Preserving Land, Preserving History, a series on the history of selected properties in the more than 30,000 acres currently under easement with the Tecumseh Land Trust. We are nearly one-third of the way toward our goal of preserving 100,000 acres in Clark and Greene counties. In our work, we've compiled histories of some of the farms and preserved areas. These often begin with the first surveys and recorded deeds, but of course Ohio was inhabited long before the first European settlers moved into the territory. There are few remaining artifacts of the earliest prehistoric people in Ohio, but around 1000 BCE, the beginning of what is called the early woodland period, the mound builders began to settle in these lands. The first were the Adena people, who migrated from the south. They were succeeded by the Hopewell of the Middle Woodland period and the Fort Ancient culture of the late prehistoric period. These mound-building cultures were Ohio's earliest farmers. By the time Eastern woodland peoples began to populate Ohio in the early 18th century, Native American agriculture consisted of some sophisticated regenerative farming practices. The main crops grown by indigenous peoples were corn, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters, which were planted symbiotically. Corn stalks functioned as supports for the beans fixed nitrogen into a usable form for the other crops, and the long squash vines with their large leaves shaded the soil and suppressed weeds between the corn stalks. Intercropping is known to create biodiversity, which can attract beneficial and predatory insects to minimize pests and improve soil quality. Native cultures also developed storage systems for saving seeds and practiced selective breeding, creating over 700 varieties of corn by the year 1500. Western Ohio was home to the Shawnee and Miami peoples when large numbers of white settlers began to move in. French and British fur traders had been present in the territory for many years, with the British claiming ownership of the lands north of the Ohio River after the French and Indian War. After the Revolutionary War, the territory became part of the United States. Some of the original colonies claimed parts of the area, but gradually ceded those lands to the federal government, which wanted to raise much-needed funds by selling the land to settlers. But what of the indigenous peoples? The following comes from the official Ohio Lands Book published by the Auditor of State. Quote, administering its new lands was a priority of the American government. First, Indian claims to that land had to be cleared, so U.S. commissioners met representatives of several Indian tribes at Fort McIntosh in 1784-85 and concluded a treaty that called for restricting most Ohio Indians in a reserve between the Cuyahoga and Maumee rivers. Most Ohio lands would now be open for settlement. The United States considered this a valid treaty and proceeded on that assumption. The Ohio Indians, especially the Shawnee, refused to abide by a treaty negotiated under duress by minor tribal chiefs who lacked the authority to speak for their people and for other tribes. The Shawnee were even coerced into yet another irregular treaty at Fort Finney in 1786. Further U.S. efforts did nothing to alleviate the Indian sense of betrayal, nor their determination to resist with force any attempt by settlers to penetrate their Ohio lands." Unquote. This resistance in the early 19th century was led by Blue Jacket and by our organization's namesake, Tecumseh, who was born in the old Chillicothe settlement in what is now Greene County. The Shawnee tribe to which he belonged had been forced west into Indiana, and Tecumseh and his followers wanted to stop further white settlement in the Northwest Territory. The Treaty of Fort Wayne, in which Native peoples lost another 3 million acres, could only force his people further west. He traveled extensively, attempting to unify tribes all over the territory, as well as in the Deep South, while his brother remained in the Shawnee settlement. Tecumseh formed alliances with the British during the War of 1812 and eventually fell at the Battle of the Thames in present-day Ontario on October 5, 1813. For more information on the struggles of this period, check out the recent biography of Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, spiritual leader of the Shawnee, by historian Peter Cousins. And watch the site of the Tecumseh Motel on Route 68. The state of Ohio is building a small park with an interpretive center telling the story of Tecumseh and his people. The fledgling U.S. government's organization of lands beyond the original 13 colonies had begun in Tecumseh's youth, after the Land Ordinance of 1785 created the rules for surveying, selling, and settling the new territories. The 1787 Northwest Ordinance outlined their governance. The ordinance contained an abbreviated Bill of Rights, which had not been part of the Articles of Confederation. It also prohibited slavery in the territory, though it did include a fugitive slave clause. The Ohio River effectively became an extension of the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary drawn between Pennsylvania and Maryland. The standardized system established under the 1785 ordinance was as follows, quoting again from the Ohio Lands Book. Land ceded by the states and purchased from the Indians was to be divided into 6-mile square townships created by lines running north and south, intersecting at right angles with east-west lines. Townships were to be arranged in north-south rows called ranges. Most townships were to be subdivided into 36 1-mile square sections. Each range, township, and section was to be numbered in a regular, consistent sequence, unquote. In our area, the ranges and townships are numbered in the opposite direction from the earliest surveys, but apart from that, the above guidelines were used when most of Ohio was laid out. While the greater part of Clark and Greene counties was part of the Between the Miamis survey area, the easternmost area of our counties were in the Virginia Military District, an area that had been surveyed privately. Because this survey was already underway while the new government was designing the system of rectangular patterns, the meets and bounds method of early colonial settlers was used. Tracts were determined by natural boundaries such as rivers, rocks, and trees, which caused great confusion and much litigation as those markers changed. This is the only area of Ohio not originally surveyed in the rectangular patterns. Land grants in the Virginia Military District were compensation offered to the colony's veterans of the French and Indian War and the War for Independence. A former private could expect a bounty of 100 acres, while a major general could claim as much as 15,000 acres. The heirs of those killed in the wars were also eligible for warrants. Veterans and their heirs could sell these warrants, which resulted in a great deal of speculation in this part of the territory. The area eventually called Between the Miamis was purchased by John Cleve Symmes, a member of the Continental Congress, who was granted a contract by Congress for 1 million acres in 1788 at a cost of 66 2/3 cents per acre. The land covered by this contract included much of southwest Ohio. Symmes was appointed judge of the Northwest Territory and moved to the Cincinnati area in 1788. He and his associates began to sell the land within the large district for the same price he paid per acre, allowing him no profit. At that rate, with much of the land unsold, he could not collect the funds required for payment, by the due date of his contract in 1794, so Congress issued him a patent for just the 311,000 acres he could afford, those comprising parts of the modern counties of Hamilton, Claremont, Butler, and Warren. The area, referred to as the Symmes Purchase, is therefore only the southern portion of the region he and his associates had begun to sell, while the portion to the north is now known as the Between the Miami Survey. Those who had purchased parcels in the northern section from Symmes had no legal title at that time. Under the Land Act of 1796, the remaining lands could not be sold for less than $2 per acre. Later legislation gave preemption to settlers who had been left in the lurch by Symmes, and they were allowed to purchase the property for 66 2/3 cents for the second time. Still, $1.32 1/3 cents per acre was a bargain. John Symmes may have mismanaged his land sales, but he did enable small farmers to settle in the territory. Before his time, parcels had only been sold as 640-acre units, the full square mile of a section, encouraging sales to speculators. Symmes allowed purchases of quarter sections and even half-quarter sections, and he extended credit. An accurate survey of Between the Miamis was conducted from 1802 to 1805, with sales permitted as each portion of the survey was completed. Purchases of lands in this survey and the rest of southwest Ohio were made through the Cincinnati Land Office, one of several in what became the new state of Ohio in 1803. Here is an example of some of the many patents that were issued by that office, some of which have been digitized. Property descriptions in the Between the Miamis survey may appear complicated at first. When you read something like the southwest quarter of the northeast quarter of a given section, just picture a diagram like this one. Note this 1813 document from the Cincinnati Land Office, which describes a lot in Champaign County in Section 26, Township 5, Range 10. Today that lot is in Clark County's Moorfield Township. The patent reads Champaign County because Clark was not created until 1818, when land was taken from Greene, Madison, and Champaign to form the new county named for George Rogers Clark. If you own land in a town in Greene or Clark County, the description of your property may include a lot number from the original platting or the name of an addition to the town boundaries. If you own property in a rural area, the description will include either section, township, range designation from the Between the Miamis survey, or a survey number in the Virginia Military District. Now that we have a little background, we can begin to look at some specific properties. Join us for further installments in this series, in which we will share the histories of several area farms, a house or two, and some of the natural areas protected by our land trust easements. This is Kim Iconis for the Tecumseh Land Trust.